All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Contemporary Economic Policy Issues. This is unfortunately the last talk in this series, but hopefully Need will be back to UC Santa Cruz at some point in the near future. Today, we're going to talk about the black-white wealth gap. I feel it's nice that I had the opportunity to present the history of discriminatory policies in U.S. history last week. Because that really informs a lot of the talk today. And there's a slide in the talk today that I normally spend a fair amount of time on that I don't have to, so we can cover a broader set of material. Okay, so again, submit questions in the chat, please. Let me get my chat window back up. There we go. There'll be plenty of time at the end for verbal Q&A, but I'll try and grab your questions out of chat as they come up. The slides are available on Need's website, and the recording will also be available there as well. I'll send both links to Lois again. Okay, so let's get on with the black-white wealth gap. This is a slide deck that was authored by myself and Derek Hamilton at the New School. It was reviewed by Patrick Mason and Stephen Craig at the University of Florida and at Florida State University and University of Houston, respectively. Again, one of those is identifiably liberal and one is identifiably conservative, and only what they agree on has made it into the deck. So what are we going to do? First, we're going to provide some evidence of the disparities. We'll talk a little bit about why wealth is important. I think that's reasonably obvious to most of us, but it's worth elucidating why. We'll talk about sources of disparities. Why is it that the wealth gap exists? We'll talk about some of the implications of the disparities, and then we'll talk about some policy options for solving the problem. Before we get on to the evidence of the black-white wealth gap, let's talk a little bit about wealth. First, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So when I talk about wealth, what I'm really talking about is a household's net asset holdings. Income is a flow of funds into a household every year. Wealth is a stock, right? So it's the total value of all assets minus the value of all debts. I may in this talk use both the terms wealth and net worth. They mean exactly the same thing, and I apologize for sometimes using both of them. And again, assets can be physical or financial. Here's a list of the assets that are included. It's not an exhaustive list, and here's a list of the debts that are included. The data primarily come from the Board of Governors. Every 3 years, they put out a survey of consumer finances, and that is, as far as I'm aware, the best source of data on household wealth. Okay, so we talked a little bit a couple of weeks ago about wealth inequality. Let me talk just a little bit more about it now. Just how unequal is wealth distributed? Unequally is wealth distributed in the United States. And well, if we broke up the country, the top 1% would own the vast majority of the western part of the United States. The next 9% would own the vast majority of the northeastern part, and the bottom 90% would own this sliver down at the bottom, right? So remarkably unequally distributed. The CBO put out a study not long ago, the Congressional Budget Office, that looked at total family wealth over time by wealth group, right? So here is that top 10%. That I showed in the map just a second ago, owning most of the upper portion of the United States. And you can see, two things to note from this graph. These are in inflation-adjusted dollars. So net worth or wealth in the United States has grown really dramatically, right? It's about 4 times greater than it was back in 1989. Growth, especially among the top 10%, has occurred. A little bit of growth amongst the next 40%. But if you look at the bottom 50%, that's the dark shaded area down here, it's about the same width in 1989 as it is in 2019. So maybe a little uptick in the bottom 50%, but not very much. So we've been generating an awful lot of wealth over the course of the last almost 40 years, but it's been going to a very select part of the population. We can look a little longer and look at changes in the wealth distribution between 1963 and 2016. Let me take a second to explain this graph again. It's in inflation adjusted terms. So these are thousands of 2016 dollars. And the orange line here, that's the distribution of wealth in 1963. And what it does, what it shows us is the average wealth by percentile. So you break up the distribution into 100 different pieces, each of which represents 1% of all of the households. And it shows you the average wealth in those households, the average net worth. So if we go up here to the top, in 1963, the average wealth of the 1% of the wealthiest families in the United States was about $1.5 million. If we go back over here to the left, you can see the orange tail over here is right at about zero, right? So those in the bottom part of the wealth distribution have zero or negative wealth. The gray line is the distribution in 2016, right? For most of the distribution, it is significantly above where it was in 1963, and that's all that wealth that we created, right? But it's showing you that all that wealth is going to the top and primarily to the tippy top, right? In the top 1%, right? The average net wealth has gone from $1.5 million up to $10.4 million. So the 99th percentile, the 1% of the richest households, their wealth has increased by a factor of about 7 since 1963. If you go down to the bottom of the distribution, you can see that this gray line actually trends down, right, towards the bottom of the distribution. And that means that down here at the bottom, the lowest wealth households, in fact, have negative wealth to a greater extent than they did in 1963. So the wealth distribution has changed dramatically in favor of those up at the top and away from those at the bottom. Okay, with that sort of as some background, now we can turn to the black-white wealth gap. And I think I showed you this graph last week. Let me talk a little bit more about it. Right, so throughout the presentation, I've tried to maintain the color scheme that blue bars represent white households and the maroon bars represent black households. Right, so on the left-hand side, we've got mean wealth for each of those two categories. Mean wealth for white households is about $1 million. Mean wealth for black households is about $142,500. Right, so if we look at averages or the mean, we find that wealth in white households is about 7 times greater than it is in black households. Now, this statistic includes Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, and other super rich individuals and households. And because of that, a lot of people prefer to look at the median, right? What's the median? Well, the median is the household right in the middle of the distribution. Right, so if we rank households from the lowest wealth up to the highest wealth, take the household in the middle and ask what is their level of wealth. Well, if we do that for white households, we find that their level of wealth is 188.2 thousand, and for black households is 24.1 thousand. Right, so here again we find a significant gap. By the median measure, wealth for white households is about 8 times greater than it is for black households. Right, and I should have said this, but the median is often a better choice when it comes to wealth because, you know, if Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Warren Buffett are dramatically increasing their wealth, that's not going to change the median. Right? Okay, all right. So there's some evidence of the gap. Let's look at some of the changes over time. Here is change between 1989 and 2019. The maroon line is wealth. Mean wealth in black households, and the solid blue line up here is mean wealth in white households. Right, so you can see, you know, a little bit of growth in mean wealth of black households, significantly more growth in white households, and that's caused the ratio of the two, that's the dashed line, the ratio of the two to go from 5.5. So back in 1989, white wealth was on average 5.5 times what it was in black households, and by 2019, white wealth is about 7 times greater than it is in black households. We're approaching 3 years, the release of 2022 data, which will show us what happened during the pandemic, and I'm really anxious to see those data. I don't think that it will show that things have improved for black households relative to white. Okay, I talked a little bit earlier about the bottom part of the distribution. the share of families. Here we've got the share of families with zero or negative wealth. Right. So if we look at all households, that has increased between 1983 and 2016 from about 15.5% up to 21%. Right. Again, now what I showed you with the graph from 1963 up to 2016, right? Oops. The bottom part of the distribution is worse off than it was in 1963. Right. And for white households, the bottom part of the distribution is still worse off. For Black households, it's worse off as well. Right. In Black households, it's more than a third of all Black households that have zero or negative wealth. The story is a little bit different for Latino households. The proportion of those households with zero or negative wealth is actually declining. I have some theories about that. And that is that, there's a growing percent of the Latino community that is second generation, and that they are doing better in terms of wealth than the first generation was. First generation, 40%, second generation is drawing that down to 33%. But I don't, again, that's my supposition. I have not seen or been able to find data that supports or disputes that. All right, so we've got an enormous gap in wealth. Bottom part of the distribution is getting worse off, especially well, it's not getting worse faster for Black households, but it is at a higher level for Black households than it is for white. Right, so let's talk a little bit now about why wealth is important. Right, wealth is important in two different dimensions. Right, wealth is important to the individuals in the household. Right, it gives individuals in the household more choices. Right, or life agency, as people like to refer to it. The second reason it's important to individuals in the household is that wealth is iterative. I'll talk in a second about what I mean by that. It's also important to broader society. Right? If Elon Musk has all of the wealth in society, that means that there's not much wealth left for the rest of us to go to college and develop human capital. And in an economy that's increasingly reliant on human capital, the widening of the wealth distribution is putting that need. It's increasing that need. Entrepreneurship and innovation, right? People with low levels of wealth are much less likely to be entrepreneurial or to innovate. It's important for a broader set of reasons than that, and I'll go into that again in just a second. Let's go back to individuals in the household, right? And when I say choices or life agency, here is a list of things, right, that you have broader choice, you have broader discretion over if you have higher levels of wealth rather than lower levels of wealth. Right, finance a high quality education, right? Maybe you can afford to go to Harvard instead of going to the local community college. You can live in good neighborhoods. I think I talked a little bit during the mobility talk about how important it is to grow up in a neighborhood with amenities, with role models, and with good schools, right? It matters a lot. If you've got some wealth, you can have savings for retirement. You've got capital to start a business. Right? That's where that entrepreneurship comes into, right? You can withstand financial hardship. Here's a statistic that I don't think I've shared with you. It was pre-pandemic, but it probably hasn't changed very much. And that is that before the pandemic, 40%, 4 in 10 households did not have the financial resources to withstand a $400 financial emergency. Right, so 40% of households did not have $400 available to them. 4 in 10. That to me is a staggeringly large number. And that's only gotten worse as the wealth distribution has gotten worse. Better legal counsel, right? If you find yourself having run afoul of the law, you don't have to be saddled with just the defense attorney that you get from the state. You can go out and hire better counsel. You can exert political influence, and I think we've seen a lot of that amongst the wealthy lately. You can finance costly medical procedures, right? A lot of people who don't have much wealth and need a costly medical procedure simply don't get it because it's beyond their means. And bequests, you can leave money to your kids, right? Okay, and I mentioned that wealth is iterative. What do I mean by that? I mean that wealth begets more wealth. Right? I guarantee you that and I'm guessing pretty much everybody on this Zoom, none of us have access to the same investments that Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett have access to. right? If you have a lot of wealth, you're going to get access to investments that you can't have access to if you don't, right? And I showed, I think in the first week, I showed how the returns to investments to the best investments in the economy. I showed how over the course of the last 40 years or so, the top return has gone from something like 20% up to 120%. Right. Well, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, they're getting access to those 120% return investments, and I am certainly not. And wealth transfers across generations are very important. We talked about mobility last time, right? Wealth is sticky. If you're born into a household with relatively more wealth, you're likely to be in a household as an adult with relatively more wealth. So that's why it's important. Now let's talk a little bit more about why parental wealth is important, right? It's important because it influences, your ability to go off to college. It influences ultimately the returns to education. Right? If your parents are in a wealthier family, then most of their friends are likely to be wealthy, and you're likely to end up in a better job. And it's shown that your income as an adult is the income of offspring as an adult is likely to be higher if born into a wealthier household. Right. And, there are clearly enormous differences in the wealth held by parents of Black and white children, right? 7 times by mean, 8 times by median. It's also reasonably clear that nurture plays a big role, right? There's always in every outcome, every economic outcome, there's a debate over, is it nature or is it nurture, right? And you might think that it's nature because if my parents did very well and they got very wealthy, perhaps there's something innate in them that fostered that development of wealth. Right. And if there's something innate in them, then it's probably going to be innate in their offspring as well. Right. So there's probably a nature component. But there was a study of twins that were separated at birth. Both were adopted out, separated at birth. I think it was in Sweden. And it tracks their wealth development over time. And it relates that to differences in the wealth of the households that they were adopted into. Right. And what they found is that kids adopted into higher wealth households tended to have higher wealth as adults than did their twin sibling that was adopted into a lower wealth household. Right. So nurture plays a big role. Nurture, role models, emphasis on what you do for a living around the house, that all matters a lot for your full future wealth development. And just to take us back a week, and to show you again the stickiness of wealth, right? Recall that if wealth was not sticky at all, your chances of being high wealth up here in the upper left quadrant, if you were born into a low wealth household, will be 20%. The probability of being high wealth if you're born into a high wealth household, upper right corner, here would be 20%. Right? 20% all across the board. It would be a crapshoot. It was like somebody picked you up and dropped you on this matrix and said, okay, here's where you're going to be. It doesn't matter what your parental wealth is. Well, we all know that it matters a lot. It matters a lot. If you're born into a low wealth household, you're less likely to be high wealth as an adult. If you're born into a high wealth household, you're more likely to be high wealth as an adult. Okay, so that's how wealth matters for individuals in the household. What about for society, right? Lots of benefits for society. We get more human capital development. I talked about that a little bit. We're becoming more human capital intensive as an economy. We need more people to get more human capital. And if fewer people have access to wealth, then fewer people are going to be getting human capital. Increased entrepreneurship, right? Lots of studies that talk about how entrepreneurship and new business formation is the lifeblood of the economy. And it certainly helps. And more entrepreneurship is certainly better for an economy than is less. A healthier labor force, right? You're going to get people who take care of themselves and maintain their health by going to see the doctor sometimes when they don't have to, or early on when they do have to, and therefore are made healthier. With less social unrest. Remember the movement of a couple of decades ago, less reliance on social programs, right? If you have wealth that can sustain you in periods of economic difficulty, then you might not turn to social programs. And there would be a smaller stock of student loans. I can't imagine there's anybody on here who hasn't heard about the student loan, the student debt crisis. Needs working on a slide deck on student loans. And what I think I've been learning is that it's not actually a crisis. It's more a change in how people will function as adults and things that they have access to. It's still very, very much the case that going to college, even if you come out with a lot of loans, going to college is a really, really good investment. Okay, and that's my aside for that. All right, so let's dig into some of the sources of disparities, right? Last week, I spent the entire hour and a half talking about a bunch of sources of disparities. So I'm not going to talk through these, but I think it's fairly evident how pretty much each and every one of these different policies, programs, or happenstance led to diminished wealth in the Black community relative to the white community, right? And so because of all of these policies, right, as a result, Black families have a much lower accumulation of wealth than white families, right? Implications: there's less financial contribution from parents to children. Black children are more likely to be born in that lower part of the wealth distribution, so they're less likely to be high wealth as adults. Means also that kids will have more difficulty accessing higher education, and there will be less capital for business formation. Right? Not only will there be less capital for business formation, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there will be fewer role models in Black households. Right. Remember last week I talked about how in the South there was a fee for starting a new business. It was $100 for Blacks, and it was $0 for whites. Also the case that because of a lot of land theft, a lot of Black small businesses were put out of business. So simply the formation of businesses amongst Black families has been much less than it has been for white families. Right. So role models are not as likely to be there. Right. They're more likely to live in disadvantaged neighborhoods where, again, there are fewer role models, fewer people who have achieved high levels of economic success, and there's going to be less access to quality education. I'm not sure I talked last week about property taxes and about how property taxes ultimately lead to a very unequal distribution of educational quality. Right? Because low-income neighborhoods are going to have low levels of property taxes, and there's going to be low levels of funding for the schools. Right? Black kids are more likely to live in low-income neighborhoods and less likely, and hence more likely to be subject to lower quality education. And all of this, quite simply put, has led to significant disparities in the capacity to build wealth. I want to be really careful here that I'm not saying the innate capacity of Black individuals relative to white. I'm saying the availability of resources with which to build wealth. Black kids, simply throughout their younger part of their life, they have less access to the resources that are necessary to later on build wealth. There are a bunch of other potential explanations in kind of the common narrative surrounding the Black-white wealth gap. And they run the gamut from differences in income and wages. Well, if only Black individuals would take the same occupations that white individuals do and get the same income or wages, then that would solve the problem. Educational attainment, I'll show you there are disparities there. Home ownership, savings and financial literacy, soft skills and personal responsibility, differences in the rate of entrepreneurship, differences in family structure. This is a really important one because it's one that gets a lot of treatment as an explanatory factor. And I'll show you that it's not necessarily right. Your initial endowment, we've talked about that, and incarceration rates. Right? We'll talk more about it, but if you are incarcerated as a young man or a young woman, when you come out, there are going to be enormous barriers to your generating wealth. Right? So we'll take a look at that. First, let's turn to income and wages. Right? What do we find here? Well, first, it's important to note. I think we probably all suspect it, but here it is in blue and maroon. This is the distribution of income for white households in navy blue and Black households in maroon, right? And what I've done is I've organized these by quintile, right? So down here on the left-hand part, this is the first quintile. So this is the 20% of households with the lowest levels of income. And about 18% of white households are in there, and about a third of Black households are in there. Right, so Black households are grossly disproportionately represented down here in the bottom part of the income distribution. If we go up here to the second quintile, this is the 20 to 40th percent lowest households, lowest income households. The disparity is smaller here, but it's still significant. Right? A quarter of Black households are in this quintile. When we get into the middle, middle and higher levels of income, Black households, because they're more highly represented down here, they're going to be less well represented in the higher income categories, right? You get up to the fifth quintile, it's the 20% of highest income households. White households are slightly overrepresented, and Black households are significantly underrepresented, right? About half the number of Black households are in this top quintile, as would be if income was distributed evenly. And Black households are even more poorly represented in the top 5%, the 5% of highest income households. If we look at earnings, there are big gaps in Black-white earnings. And this is controlling for education level, and it's also controlling for gender, right? So if we look at men with a high school diploma, what this is telling us is that in the 1980s, the blue bar here is the 1980s, that Black men earned about 20% less than did white men. It got just a little bit worse in the 1990s, and it got worse still in the 2000s, right? We would like to think that this gap is going in the other direction, that things are getting better, but it's not. That's men with a high school diploma. If we look at men with a bachelor's degree, we can see that in the 80s versus 90s versus 2000s, things are getting significantly worse, right? Black men with a bachelor's degree are earning significantly less than their white counterparts, and things are trending in the wrong direction. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. We see the same thing if we look at women. If we look at women with a high school diploma, the gap is smaller. So in the 1980s, Black women with a high school diploma were earning about 5 or 6% less than white women. By the 90s, that had grown to about 9% and to about 11% in the 2000s. If we look at women with a bachelor's degree, no gap in the 1980s. The gap grew to about 3% and then to 6% in the 2000s, right? So if we look at gaps by wages or by earnings, we see that things are getting a little bit worse. Okay, so we now know what's going on with incomes, right? Black households are disproportionately represented in the lower part of the income distribution, and there's a gap in earnings between Black and white individuals. So you might suspect that these gaps would explain a lot of the Black-white wealth gap. Well, it turns out that they really don't. Right, so here what we've got is median net worth, and this is the bottom 20%, the 20% of households in the U.S. economy with the lowest levels of wealth. And if we look at median net worth for white households, it's 10%. I'm sorry, it's $10,000. If we look for Black households, it's 0. Right, so there's a big gap here down at the bottom. There's another gap in the next quintile. Gap exists in the middle. Gap exists in the fourth quintile. And the gap is about 2 times higher in white households than it is in Black. Up here in the second 10%. If you look at the top 10%, the 10% of wealthiest households, you see there's a significant gap in the level of wealth. Right, so Black households have median net worth of about $335,000, and white households about $1.8 million. So even if you adjust by wealth, I'm sorry, even if you adjust by income, I may have said that wrong. These are quintiles. So this is the lowest 20% of households in terms of income. This is the highest 10% of households in terms of income. I apologize if I messed that up. So even if you adjust by income, there's an enormous gap in Black and white wealth. And it's important to point out, right, that income inequality does not equate to equality of wealth. This blue line, these are all in inflation-adjusted dollars. This blue line shows what happened to wealth in high-income white households between 1984 and 2007. It grew significantly. This darker blue line shows what happened to median wealth in middle income white families, it increased, not as significantly. But if you look at high income and middle income Black households, you find that there was virtually no growth and maybe a decline in net worth, right? So income does not necessarily drive wealth. So equating incomes is not necessarily going to equate wealth. And
John, can I ask about that?
Sure.
See if I can articulate my question. Is when you're in these last two charts, if you're in the top 10% of white versus Black, the actual income you have is very different. Is that correct?
Well, so no. So it's in the top 10% of all households. If you take the Black households that are in the top 10% of the entire income distribution, right? So we have one cutoff from the universe of people, and you take Black households that are in that part of the distribution, that top 10%, their net worth is significantly lower than their white companions, if you will, in that part of the distribution. Does that help?
So another way of saying it, if you had two families that were making the same income, the white families would have used this money to accumulate more wealth than the Black families.
That's yes. But that infers I'm struggling with the way you put that. I would more likely say that white families were better able to put that money towards developing wealth than were Black families, right? Because, partly because a lot of what happens in white families is that my parents will bequeath me some of their income, some of their wealth. But what much more often, what happens in Black families is that the high income children will be giving a lot of money to their low income parents, right? Instead of paying it forward, they're paying it backward, right? And paying it forward increases the ability of high income white households to generate wealth. Paying it backward reduces the ability of high income Black households to generate wealth.
Okay, thanks. Thanks.
You bet. Okay, right. So income inequality does not equate with equality of wealth. How about educational attainment? Right. I think it's a no-brainer that there's a correlation between your level of education and the amount of wealth that you have. But let's talk about it a little bit, right? So I think it's about 25% of the U.S. population has a college degree. And people with a college degree have 71% of all of the wealth. Right. So getting a college degree is a really good indicator of the amount of wealth you're going to have. Those with some college have about 16% of the wealth. Those with only high school diploma have 8.6% of all the wealth. And those with no high school have 4.3% of all the wealth. We can look more closely at exactly what that means, increasing education. So median net worth for somebody with no high school is about $23,000. Mean net worth is about $157,000. And if you go up by educational category, you find that both median and mean increase significantly. Right? Okay, so if there are differences in the extent of educational attainment between white and Black households, that's going to help explain some of the differences in wealth. And it turns out that there are significant differences, right? I was wrong, it's not 25%, it's about 33% of the US population that has at least a college degree, right? So this dark blue part of the bar represents having a bachelor's degree. The maroon part is representing having a master's degree. The pink part is having a professional degree, like a JD. And then the top purple part here is having a PhD, right? So everybody in this top part has at least a bachelor's degree. If we look just at Black individuals, it's 25%. And if we look at white individuals, it's 36%, right? So the likelihood that a white individual is going to have a college education is about double what it is for a Black individual. So there are big differences in educational attainment, right? So the narrative goes, well, if only Black individuals would get as much college get as much education as white individuals do, then that would take care of the black-white wealth gap. Well, really not so fast, right? Not so fast. It's certainly true that for Black individuals as well as white individuals, getting more education matters for your level of wealth. If we look just at white individuals, right, those with less than a high school diploma have median household net worth of about $83,000, and those with a degree post-college have median net worth of about $500,000, right? So as education goes up, so too does median net worth. In the Black community, it's the same. The relationship is the same. As education goes up, so does net worth, right? But it goes up, it starts at a lower level and it goes up much, much more slowly, right? And a really, I think, disconcerting thing to note on this graph is that if you look at Black individuals with a college degree versus white individuals with less than a high school diploma, the white households headed by somebody with less than a high school diploma have in fact more wealth than do Black households headed by somebody with a college degree. Right? So education matters. It certainly matters. But even if you equalize the extent of education, there's still going to be a significant Black-white wealth gap there. All right. What about home ownership? Right, so this gives you home ownership rates for a variety of races and ethnicity. The line up here at the top, this is the home ownership rate for white non-Hispanic households. 72% of white non-Hispanic households own their own home. Let's go down here to the bottom. Black households, only 42% of them own their own home. So there's an enormous disparity in terms of home ownership. And does home ownership matter for wealth? It does. Right? This is all individuals, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian. If you're a renter, your median net worth is going to be about $5,200. Your mean net worth about $91,000. If you're an owner, your median net worth is going to be about $250,000. If the mean is going to be at about $1 million. Right now, this isn't really a fair comparison, right? Because renters are going to be younger than owners. Renters are going to be poorer than owners. Right? But if we look at the same comparison as we do with education, right, the extent to which it matters for white households is much greater than the extent to which it matters for Black households, right? Black households that own their own home, they're going to have median net worth of about $100,000. The white households will have median net worth of about $239,000. Right? So, even if you equalize the rates of home ownership, you're not going to close the wealth gap significantly. Right? Why, is there such a difference in home ownership? Well, we documented it last week. There's well-documented evidence on historical and ongoing housing and lending discrimination. There's discrimination in the appraisal stage we talk about, buyers, lenders, local laws, covenants, right? And it's also true that home prices, home values, and rates of appreciation are lower in Black neighborhoods than they are in white neighborhoods. A report put out by the Brookings Institution found that home values are 50% lower in majority Black neighborhoods than they are in majority white neighborhoods. 50% lower. That's taking equivalent homes. Well, no, if we take equivalent homes, if we adjust for the amenities and the size of the home, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, it's found that homes in Black neighborhoods are about 23%, worth 23% less than is a comparable home in a white neighborhood, right? So home values are lower and rates of appreciation are also lower, right? So more broadly, what determines differences in home ownership is wealth of parents, right? When I moved out here, I borrowed money from my father to buy my first house. The ability to borrow, and that was something accessible to me that's not accessible to most Black individuals. Ability to borrow, go to a bank and say, hey, I'd like a mortgage. It's harder for Black households to do that. And if they do get a mortgage, they're not likely to get it on, they're likely to get it on different terms than will a white borrower, right? There are local ordinances, it says discrimination in where you can buy a house. And again, lower appreciation rates for homes in majority Black communities. And if you look at a home as an investment and you're a Black household thinking about buying a home as an investment, and you see that its rate of appreciation is less than a white household would be getting, the white household is more likely to make the investment and buy the house, and the black household is less likely to make the investment and buy the house. And so those are some of the explanations for the difference in home ownership. And again, even if we equalized home ownership, there's going to be a significant gap in net worth or wealth. It's often claimed that there are issues with regard to savings, there are differences with regard to savings and financial literacy between black households and white households. The argument goes, well, if only black households would save the way the white households do, then they would build more wealth, and that would reduce the gap. And if only black households were as financially literate as were white households, they would make better investments, right? Well, the data really don't show that these things are accurate, right? It turns out that with regard to savings, if you adjust for household income, if you take a black and a white household at the same level of income, what the data show is that blacks actually save more than whites do. Right, so the savings argument runs once you control for household income, right? And this is one of the most important things to take out of this talk. If you're going to make comparisons across races, you have to control for household income, right? Because Latino households are have lower income than white households. Black households have lower income, so you have to control for income. You have to compare apples with apples, if you will. Right, so black households, on average, controlling for income, have higher savings rates than do white households. Right, with regard to financial literacy, if you just look at averages, you find that white households, white investors, take on investments with higher risk and hence higher reward than do black households or black investors. But again, if you look at the data and you control for income, it's not clear, right? And if you think about asset accumulation, it starts with a house probably. And if you're lower income, that's going to eat up most of your available funds for making investments, right? You're going to have less money to put in the stock market than will a higher income household. So it makes sense that on average, because incomes on average are lower, risk and reward for black investors are lower than risk and reward for white investors, right? Income also influences your access to and tolerance for higher risk investments. Again, and if you control for household income, and this speaks to the financial literacy aspect, right? If there were big differences in financial literacy between white households and black households, when you control for income, if there were big differences in financial literacy between white and black households at the same level of income, you would find that at that level of income, white households get higher returns. The rate of asset appreciation would be higher than in black households. But what the data find is that when you control for income, there is no difference in the rate of asset appreciation between black and white households, right? Suggesting there's no appreciable difference in financial literacy, right? So differences in savings and financial literacy, that plays absolutely no role in the black-white wealth gap. Why do people think and maintain that it does? Well, I'm pretty sure that it stems from this fact, right? So this graph shows you the likelihood that each race uses payday lending relative to whites, right? So if we control by race, the maroon bar here, that's black households. Black households are 34.5% more likely to use payday lenders than black, right? And why is that a good indicator of financial literacy? Well, because as I'm sure most of you are aware, it's a really, really bad idea to use a payday lender, right? They're going to charge high fees. The rate of interest is going to be astronomical. It's a really bad idea. So the notion is, well, if you're financially literate, you're not going to be using payday lending services. Well, low-income households can be financially literate and use payday lending services because they don't have other options, right? So there's a huge difference in the use of payday lending between black and white households, and that suggests that the rate of financial literacy is very different. If we control for race and income, here's what we find, that Black households are now just 4.4% more likely to use payday lenders than are white households, right? It's not going to be statistically significant. This says that if you control for income, again, very, very important to control for income, then there's not a big difference in the use of payday lenders. Not a big difference in something that you might observe and say is an indication of differences in financial literacy, right? So we can throw savings and we can throw financial literacy out the window. And this one is the one that is sort of most disappointing to me to have to talk about. But this whole notion of employability. I remember in the 80s, there were conversations about showing up on black time, right? Where black time is, always showing up late, right? So there's this notion that Black employees, they don't show up on time for work, they don't make eye contact with customers, they don't dress well, and they don't have the collaborative skills necessary to be good employees, right? The reality is that all of these things matter if you're working directly with customers, right? And the reality also is that Black workers are crowded into service sector jobs where they are more likely to work with customers than in other parts of the economy. So they're well represented in service, sales, and office production, transportation, and material moving, right? These are all parts of the economy where you deal with customers, and they are relatively less well represented in construction, extraction, and maintenance, right? So these would be occupations where you're not dealing with customers, right? And your collaborative skills, none of these things matter less if you're not dealing with customers. So the reality, the jobs that Black workers have sort of put the lie to this notion of employability, right? It's not true that on average, Black workers can't show up on time or don't make eye contact with customers, don't dress well, and don't have collaborative skills. It's just not true, or we would see them crowded into occupations where they don't have to deal with customers, right? Okay, what about rates of entrepreneurship? Right here, we've got rates of entrepreneurship for white, Black, Asian, and Latino individuals. And the statistic is the number of new entrepreneurs per 100,000 adults each month, right? And this one line up here stands out. That is the rate of entrepreneurship in the Latino community, right? In the Latino community, it's higher than on all of the other communities. Why is that? I think that's primarily because it is an act of entrepreneurship to wake up in Mexico and say, I'm going to go to the United States in order to better my lot. And when a lot of immigrants get to the United States, particularly Latino immigrants get to the United States, their occupational options, their job options are not that great. So they start a business, right? Whether that business is sharpening knives or it's mowing lawns or what have you, it is being an entrepreneur. It is starting a business, right? So the immigrants that come, they're going to have higher rates of entrepreneurship, and their kids, well, they grew up in a household where all of the income came from entrepreneurship. So they have a very good role model for being an entrepreneur, and they're more likely to be an entrepreneur, right? The navy blue line here, that's the rate of entrepreneurship for white individuals. And the maroon line, again, is the rate of entrepreneurship among Black individuals, right? It is lower among Black individuals than it is among whites. And I'll maintain that a big part of that is because of a lack of role models, right? In the early part of the 20th century, right, Black individuals were actively discouraged from starting their own small business. So your family tree, if you're Black, is going to have fewer entrepreneurs in it than if you're white. A variety of other explanations for differences in entrepreneurship, right? Disparities in access to capital. That's a huge influencer, right? Wealth disparities, specifically differences in home equity. A lot of people that start a small business borrow money on their home. If you don't have a home with equity in it, you don't have that source of borrowing. A lot of people who start a small business rely on the friends and family plan. Well, if all of your friends and family are low wealth and low income, then you can't. You don't have access to that stream of financing. It turns out that Black entrepreneurs are less likely to rely on banks and more likely to rely on credit cards, right? Which means that loan essentially has a much higher rate of interest than if you went to a bank, right? And so it's going to be harder and harder to be successful, right? Even if you do go to a bank, the loan for a Black entrepreneur is going to have a higher rate of interest than it will for a white entrepreneur. And then there will be less access to venture capital funding, right? Most of the venture capital money in the United States is controlled by white men, right? And it turns out that people are more inclined to invest in people that look like them than in people that don't look like them. That means that it is very hard for women to get access to venture capital funds. It is, and is very hard for Black men to get access to venture capital funds, right? So that disparity in access is important. Generally lower levels of education amongst Black entrepreneurs, right? And the higher your level of education, the more people you're likely to have to go to for help and advice with your small business. Previous business ownership in the family, right? I mentioned this already, perhaps too many times, right? If you don't have a role model for entrepreneurship, you're not going to consider it as an option. I have spent most of my adult life being an entrepreneur. And so my son, he is 15 and he's already recognized that the path to wealth, despite that it hasn't been a path to wealth for me necessarily, the path to wealth isn't going out and getting a conventional job. He's already thinking about, okay, what new business am I gonna start? What killer app am I gonna come up with? That's the better path to wealth, right? So he has, a role model for business ownership that many kids don't. And he's more likely to be an entrepreneur than most kids. If we turn to family structure, right, this graph, this table is a lot in it, but we can just look at one portion of it, right? This area in the red box, this is comparing married households with no bachelor's degree, and it's looking at median net worth for Black households that are married with no bachelor's degree and white households that are married with no bachelor's degree, right? And if we look across ages, right, there is a significant wealth gap, age 20 to 29, age 30 to 39, significant wealth gap. There is a significant wealth gap at all ages, right? The wealth gap is reduced for sure, but even if this were the wealth gap between Black and white households that we were talking about, there would still be a whole presentation for us to talk about the gap that exists. When you control for marital status and you control for education and you control for age, there is still very significant gaps. If we go over here and we look at households headed by somebody with a bachelor's degree, married Black and white households, still a very significant gap in net worth. The gap is bigger if we look at single households, right? The gap in wealth between a single Black household and a single white household, right, is about 30 times. Gaps are bigger for single households than they are for married. But when we control for family structure, there's still a gap. Really important to point out that we've talked about intergenerational transfers and what kind of a family you grow up in matters a lot for whether or not you're going to be high wealth or low wealth. And this is really important. If we look at the distribution of kids in the Black and white community across single and married households, right? White kids that are born and grow up in a household with both parents, that's 70% of all the white kids. Black kids that grow up in a house with both parents, that's less than a third of all Black kids. Father-only households, it's about the same, but mother-only, right? This is where there's an enormous difference. Less than 20% of white kids and more than 50% of Black kids grow in a household with mothers only, right? And it will surprise absolutely nobody to know that mother-only households, mother-only headed households, have on average much less wealth than father-only households or households with both parents, right? So half of the Black kids are born a little bit behind the 8 ball in terms of wealth development because they're born to mother-only households. All right, we could launch into this whole conversation about why they're born into mother-only households, and the incarceration conversation we'll have in just a minute will play a role there, right? Again, initial endowment matters. Right? Black kids are more likely to be born into the bottom 2 quintiles. White kids are more likely to be born into the top 2 quintiles. Right? So it matters. If we look at rates of incarceration, right? Rates of incarceration differ dramatically across races. Right? For white individuals, the rate of incarceration is about 450 people per 100,000. For Black individuals, it's 2,300. So there's an enormous difference in the rate of incarceration between Black and white individuals. If we look in California, alone, California does a little bit better than the United States overall. The rate of incarceration in the United States overall is about 700 people per 100,000 in population. California about 581 per 100,000. The next highest country is about 139. Right, and this is comparing California and the U.S. to other NATO countries. I don't know what the number is for China. I suspect that it's higher. But if we look at our peers, right, we are incarcerating people at rates that are enormously higher than in our peer countries, right? And since there's such an enormous disparity by race, that matters a lot for the Black-white wealth gap. Right, really interesting here. I find it very interesting, right? If you go back to the 70s, right, there was a difference in the rate of incarceration, the rate of drug arrests per 100,000 by race between white and Black individuals. We had the war on drugs in the 1980s, and all that did was it jacked up the rate of incarceration of Black individuals significantly relative to the rate of incarceration of white individuals, right? And most of these were young Black men. Right, so we've taken young Black men and we've disproportionately thrown them into jail, right? And what that does is that causes a lot more Black kids to grow up in women, single, and households that are run by single women to a much greater extent than white households, right? In a little bit, we'll talk about a little bit more of the implications and how to change this. So what's fundamentally responsible? I would like to be able to say, well, it's individual behavior is 20%, structural characteristics of the economy is 40%, and history is the rest. But honestly, we don't have the right data to answer that question. What we know from what I've talked about is that hard work isn't enough to close the gap, right? If you work full-time or you work part-time, you know, there's still an enormous Black-white wealth gap. Income is not enough to explain the Black-white wealth gap. If you look at the highest income 20% of households, big gap exists. Lowest 20% of households, big gap exists. Studying hard isn't enough, right? Even if you compare within rates of educational attainment, I lost my pointer. Even if you look at within different levels of educational attainment, there is still a big Black-white wealth gap, right? And there have been studies out there that try to take all of these bits and pieces and put them into the same study and figure out what's responsible for the Black-white wealth gap, right? And this sort of summarizes it. The number of years of home ownership, white households own their house for, on average, more years than a comparable Black household. So home ownership, number of years of home ownership, that's responsible for a little bit more than a quarter of the Black-white wealth gap. Differences in household income, that's responsible for about a fifth. Differences in employment, responsible for less than 10%. Getting or not a college education or financial support or an inheritance, that's responsible for about 5% of the Black-white wealth gap. That leaves about 30% left unaccounted for, right? And that doesn't take into consideration racial differences in the ability to own a home. Right, so part of the gap in home ownership is responsible for is a result of differences in the ability of Black and white individuals. Right, so there is a racial component built into each one of these categories. So it's at least 30% of the Black-white wealth gap that we can't explain by looking at data at issues on which we have data. 30% of the gap remains, even if you control for home ownership, household income, employment, college education, and financial support or inheritance. Still 30% of the gap exists. What about policy options? Okay, there are a ton of policy options. We could spend all day talking about policy options. We could talk about housing, how to reverse FHA and redlining. And we could talk about inequities in healthcare. I've got a book on my desk that I can't wait to get to that is entitled Medical Apartheid. Right, in the United States, it's pretty well documented that Black individuals get worse healthcare than do white individuals. Differences, we could talk about education policy, we could talk about workforce policy. What we'll talk a little bit about is incarceration. We'll talk about income support and stability programs and asset accumulation programs. right? So let's turn first to income support and stability, right? Some specific policy options. Global solutions, right? Solutions that don't say this is a program for Black people, right? Our child trust accounts, so-called baby bonds. All right, what this is suppose that whenever a baby in the United States is born, we throw $10,000 into an account for them. And that account grows over time. It gains interest over time, so that when that individual turns 18, they now get access to that account for buying a house, for going to school, for a medical procedure, for starting a business, right? That trust account is now theirs, so they have a store of wealth when they become an adult. Guaranteed minimum income, right? It used to have basic universal income in there, but economists don't like that. We prefer guaranteed minimum income, so Elon Musk doesn't benefit from it, right? So this is saying, okay, your household will not fall below a certain level of income, right? Because the lower your level of income, the less likely you are to perform. So that would raise the standard of income for all individuals across society, Black and white. Policies that address racial disparities directly. Well, the R word, right? Reparations. California is actively contemplating reparations. The big point that I want to make here is that reparations don't have to take the form of a cash payment. They don't have to take the form of a check, right? We could instead have aggressive affirmative action, right? Affirmative action that works, right? Helps Black children get into better colleges and then supports them while they're there. We could have a new Homestead Act. The US government still owns an enormous amount of land, a lot of which is very farmable and productive. We could heavily invest in minority and Black communities. We could give differential tax treatment. I've got another book on my desk that's called The Whiteness of Wealth that talks about the current US tax system and how it, not in intent, but in effect, is discriminatory, partly because Black households are lower income than white households, and they get treated less well on average than do white households. Labor and other laws that address discrimination, we could enforce them more aggressively. We could make adjustments where necessary to make them more efficacious, right? And we could have a fundamental reorientation of our asset building agenda. The United States government has an enormous asset building agenda. The United States government spends about $400 billion a year helping households build assets. What do those programs do? Well, here's a look at what those programs do and what those programs are, right? The mortgage interest deduction, right? So that's to facilitate home ownership. Who is it that gets the mortgage interest deduction? Well, for each one of these policies, we have a bar here that tells us what proportion goes to the bottom 20% of households in terms of income and what proportion goes to the top 20% of households in terms of income. Big shocker, the mortgage interest deduction, the vast majority of that $60 to $65 billion goes to households in the top 20%. We're helping high-income households build assets. The state and local property tax deduction. This is from 2017, so it's a little bit different in the wake of the Trump taxes. But still, the bulk of the state and local property tax deduction goes to those in the top 20%. Employer-sponsored retirement plans, right? The vast majority of the nearly $200 billion that the federal government saves to subsidize these programs, the vast majority goes to individuals with incomes in the top 20%. Individual retirement accounts, almost all of that goes to individuals with incomes in the top 20%. So we have a very active, a big asset development program in the United States. It is just turned on its head. We should be spending more money to help low-income households generate assets and less money helping high-income households generate assets. If we were to take this asset building agenda, flip it on its head, right, that would help to reduce the Black-white wealth gap. As it is, this asset building agenda serves to exacerbate the Black-white wealth gap. right? Black families are much less likely to own their home. They don't get access to this. Black families are much less likely to be in the top 20%. Black individuals are much, much less likely to have employer-sponsored retirement plans. They're not in the top 20%. So this asset building agenda, and no surprise, I mean, it's relatively wealthy white men who build the asset building agenda, and it goes primarily to benefit higher income white households. All this affirmative action for white people. Reforming the criminal justice system, right? There are 45,000 state and local laws and regulations that restrict the rights of people who have contact with the criminal justice system, right? Especially if you're convicted. 45,000 state and local laws and regulations. What form do they take? Well, it can affect your ability to vote, live in public housing, qualify for occupational license, serve in the military, your ability to receive public benefits, your ability to sit on a jury, your ability to borrow money for college, right? So you can see we're disproportionately locking up Black men. So our criminal justice system is disproportionately disadvantaging young Black men when it comes to coming out and being an active member of society, when it comes to coming out and generating wealth. Right? So our criminal justice system plays a pretty significant role in the Black-white wealth gap. Lots of other concrete policy options, right? Limit the mortgage interest tax deduction and use the revenues to provide a credit for first-time home buyers, right? I bought my fourth home, I still get the tax deduction. Establish automatic savings and retirement plans, right? And most importantly, with regard to retirement plans, well, very importantly, maybe not most, but let them follow workers when they go from job to job, right? I have about 4 different 401ks, each one from a different job, and that just complicates matters. Reduce the reliance on student loans while supporting success in post-secondary education. Offer universal children's savings accounts. We talked about that. Reform safety net programs, right? So if you have a pot of wealth over here and you lose your job and you need some income support, you can't get that income support until after you've blown through all of your wealth, right? So our safety net programs require you to blow through your wealth before they will help you. And then they help you, but on the other side of it, you're in a situation where you have less wealth than when you went in, right? Perhaps we could develop a safety net that is more income related and doesn't rely on your not having any wealth, right? We can acknowledge that it's important for you to have a store of wealth. So if you fall on temporary hard times, we're going to help you without depleting your wealth. We could provide subsidies to promote emergency savings, such as those linked to tax time. We could, evaluate the implicit bias that I mentioned that exists in our current tax laws. An existing bias, Black married couples are more likely to be dual income couples than are white married couples, right? And there is a tax. They end up paying a higher amount of tax, even if their overall incomes are the same, because the Black household has 2 earners, and the white household has only 1, there is going to be a higher tax rate on the Black household than on the white household, right? And that doesn't make very much sense to me, right? We could evaluate the implicit bias that's in our tax laws and remove it, right? Suggestions that are not really policies. There's buying and banking Black, right? There's a common assertion that if the $1.3 trillion in buying power in the Black community, if all that $1.3 trillion went only to Black-owned businesses, right, that would drive progress in Black businesses. It would drive wealth creation in the Black community. The other is that if all of the money in the Black community were to be deposited into Black banks, right, that could be a source of wealth creation for the Black community. All right, well, let's take a deeper look. Let's take a look at banking Black first, right? So we need a little introduction to fractional reserve banking before we can get into that. And let's suppose that money is deposited into an account, right? Most of that money in a bank, most of that money is going to get lent out. The rest is going to be held in reserve, right? So the money that's lent out, suppose it's lent out to purchase a house. That money is then going to be deposited into a bank. most of that money is going to be lent out and the rest is held in reserve, right? And suppose that the money that's lent out is to purchase a house, the money's deposited into a bank. That's how fractional reserve works, right? The same dollar gets lent out multiple times. And so many banks are charging interests or getting interest on essentially the same deposit. That's how wealth creation happens in the banking system, right? Home loans for a while were at 3% for a 30-year mortgage, right? Nobody's getting rich 30% on a 30-year mortgage unless they're effectively using the same dollar to get 3% multiple times, right? Banking system is a very good source of wealth creation, right? So the logic is, okay, all you Black people, put your money in the Black banking system and you're going to create wealth and reduce the Black-white wealth gap. We'll talk more about that in a minute. It doesn't work for Black banks. Why is that? Because of a thing called leakage, right? Suppose that money's deposited in an account in a Black bank. And suppose that money is lent to purchase a house by a Black buyer, right? A Black individual goes to a Black bank to borrow money to buy a house, right? Well, if the seller is white, then those funds aren't going to go back into a Black bank, they're going to go into a white bank because the white individual is more likely to bank at a white bank, and they get deposited in a white bank, and then it's going to spiral, it's going to multiply around the white banking system and not the Black banking system, right? So the multiplier effect for the economy does not apply to Black banks because the money leaks out into the white part of the banking system. Right? Because the money's not allowed to only circulate in the Black community, Black banking is going to have limited capacity to generate wealth, right? And why do we suspect that money is going to leak so quickly out of the Black banking system? For a couple of reasons, right? Here is some data on the rates of home ownership. Well, it turns out that 76% of residential property is owned by white family. Only 12.5% is owned by a Black family. So odds are if a Black family goes to buy a house, they're going to be buying it from a white seller, right? And that throws the money out of the Black banking system into the white banking system, right? And the share of residential value, 80% of it is in the hands of white owners. What about sheer numbers? The number of banks and credit unions? In the United States, there are 10,655 banks and credit unions. That's a lot of banks and credit unions. Approximately 43 of those are Black owned. 43 of them. 0.4%. Black banks are also very small. The capitalization, what happened? The capitalization of all Black owned banks is $5.8 billion. The capitalization of JP Morgan Chase is $2.8 trillion. Right? So money goes where money is. Right? That's the spanner in the works, if you will. In terms of banking, money goes where money is. The money is more likely to end up in JP Morgan Chase after it's been deposited in a Black bank than it is likely to end up in another Black bank. In terms of buying Black, well, there's a similar multiplier. The same dollar gets spent multiple times. But if you go to a Black restaurant, say, that Black owner of a restaurant is going to be buying intermediate inputs. They're going to be buying dishes. They're going to be buying food. They're going to be buying a variety of things. And they could buy all of those things from other Black suppliers, but odds are they're going to get better prices from white suppliers. So a lot of that money is going to leak out of the Black buying system, right? Money is spent, it goes to Black businesses, and then the Black businesses spend it on inputs from the white community. Right, so there's that leakage in banking system. There's that leakage from the buying system as well, right? Could it be made to work? Well, you'd really have to wall off the Black banking sector and the Black economy from the rest of the country, right? And that doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense because there's a lot of trading that goes on between the Black economy and the white economy that makes both the Black economy and the white economy better off. I don't want to get into a whole lecture on international trade, but international trade, this is comparable, right? If we put a wall around the Black community, we're essentially calling it a different country, right? And if you don't allow that country to trade with the country of the white community, right, it's going to be worse off than if it were allowed to trade, right? And walling off isn't enough. right? You can imagine that there are white bankers that would figure out a way to get their hands into the black banking system and economy, right? And you know, larger white banks simply have more economic power, which means that they're more likely to generate higher returns than our black banks. So really, in order to work, in order for banking black and buying black to work, and by work, I mean causing black wealth to catch up to white wealth, right? There's a lot of catching up to do, right? In order for it to work in the banking sector, that means that black-owned banks have to generate a higher return than white-owned banks. If black-owned banks don't generate a higher return than white-owned banks, if they generate the same return, there's not going to be any catch-up. Right? It's unlikely, because if black-owned banks need to generate a higher return, then they have to pay less on deposits and they have to charge higher interest rates. Right? Well, am I going to go to the black bank for my loan then? No, I'm not. I'm going to go to the white-owned bank for better terms. In terms of buying, right, it means that black-owned businesses have to generate higher profits than white-owned businesses. Right? Me as the consumer, if black-owned businesses are generating higher profits, they're probably generating higher price. They're charging higher prices. So I'm going to go to the white-owned business to get better prices. So this implies that there can be catch-up. It implies that banks are going to generate, black banks are going to generate higher return than white banks. It implies that black-owned businesses are going to generate higher profits than our white-owned business. Both of these are extremely unlikely, very unlikely to work, right? So thinking casually about banking black and buying black, you know, and how that could help close the gap, you know, it probably could close the gap somewhat, because we would get more black-owned businesses, we would get more black-owned banks. But even if we got more of both of those, they still have to generate higher returns in order for catch-up to happen. But because they're part of a broader economy, they're competing with white-owned banks and white-owned businesses, right? They're not going to generate higher returns, right? It presupposes a higher level of capability with regard to banking and owning a business in the black community than in the white community. And that's unlikely to be the case. So let me sum up, and then we can go to the conversation, right? So the black-white wealth gap is enormous. 7 times more wealth in the white community by mean, 8 times more wealth in the white community by median. Lots of explanation we've gone through that most don't stand up to scrutiny, right? Even if you own your home, the return, the gain in wealth is less for black owners than for white owners. Government policies, we spent all the time last week talking about a lot of government policies that have contributed to this gap, right? Wealth endowments, parental wealth, they're extremely important for determining wealth in adulthood, right? So policies that address this issue are most likely to be effective. We've talked a lot about ways that things could be different in the black community, right? Rates of education, home ownership, what have you. All of that together is not going to close the gap. So if we as a society really want to close the gap, some policy intervention is going to be necessary. Natural forces are not going to get us there. And that's the bottom line. All right, of course, we did economic inequality. Inequality today is at levels last seen in the 1920s. Economic mobility, we have this American exceptionalism aspect. We have the American dream, that mobility is greater, higher, faster in the United States than other countries. It turns out that's not true anymore. And we talked a lot about policies in history that have contributed to the black-white wealth gap that we talked about today. Okay, and that's all that I have. Here again is how you might reach me, should you like to continue this conversation. But for now, I'll stop sharing, and happy to take questions for as long as you guys like me to stick around.
I had a comment.
Okay.
You left out Social Security, which I think is tremendously regressive in the way it collects the money. and it doesn't collect from the people who have the most.
You know, Nancy, you are absolutely right. Right. So it works against the Black community in raising revenues, right? Because the Black community is more likely to have more of its income under the cap than is the white community. Absolutely right. And it discriminates implicitly, not explicitly, against the Black community because lifespans of Black individuals are less than lifespans of white individuals. Right. So, you know, once you reach the age of 65, if you're white, you're more likely to get more out of the system than if you're Black. So thank you for that. That's absolutely right.
Wow. Yeah.
I had one more thing about, I remember reading something about people living in the South Side of Chicago couldn't get mortgages. Even if they couldn't get mortgages on the same beneficial terms as people living not on the South Side of Chicago, that either they were shorter terms, they were higher, they had to renew them. You know, they didn't have a guaranteed low interest rate for a long term. It was just, and then there was one other thing. When you put out those numbers of people who are incarcerated, if you adjusted it for the percentage of that group within the population, it would be horrifying.
I think that's probably right. Yeah, and going back to the South Side of Chicago, I haven't seen a redlining map for Chicago, but I will be really, really surprised if the phenomena that you're describing that's going on today wasn't really highly correlated with redlining in the past. Right. When we banned redlining, we didn't just all of a sudden start giving the same terms and the same loans to people in neighborhoods that were formerly redlined. Now it's been a slow process towards equalization. We're not nearly there yet. So you're absolutely right about what happens in the South Side of Chicago relative to, say, the North Shore of Chicago.
Okay, so I've got a lot of questions, John, but so if other people have questions, jump in. I don't want to just dominate this. One of your early figures, which really surprised me, was just showing the changes in the last 30 years and showing that the wealth gap has doubled in the last 30 years. And I mean, one sort of has the sense that there's been a building Black middle class, but this would say that that's not happening. I mean, why do you think we haven't been improving?
Why do I think it hasn't been improving, and it's been getting worse because increasingly our economic system rewards those who have already been rewarded.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The notion that wealth begets wealth is becoming increasingly true. Right? We have a system that favors businesses over labor. Right? Business owners are more likely to be higher wealth than labor. And so it's throwing more of the spoils from the economy towards business owners rather than towards workers.
So sort of related to that, one of your earlier graph where you show this difference with time in the degree to which the top 1 or 10% is capturing all the wealth. I mean, that curve is just going so straight up. I mean, I'm a science person. There is a limit. And I assume economists have to some extent described at some point you don't have an economy if 1% of the people have all the money. I mean, have economists thought about the fact that we're approaching this limit?
Yeah, there are a lot of economists who are very concerned with how unequal the distribution of wealth is becoming. I don't think I actually went through the graph when we did the inequality talk, but you know, there's if you've got zero inequality, that's really bad for the economy because there's no incentive to do anything. Mm-hmm. If you've got complete inequality, that's really bad for the economy because there's zero incentive to do anything. Mm-hmm. So somewhere in the middle there is the sweet spot, right? And I would be shocked. You know, I don't have the data to really gauge it. But I would be shocked if our level of wealth inequality is way beyond that sweet spot. We need to roll it back, and that will be good for the economy. Right? Absolutely the same thing with regard to income inequality. Yeah. Tim, did you have a question? I thought I saw your hand go up briefly.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I know that Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, he looked at this and found, much to his surprise, that the growing inequality is a feature of the capitalist system and not an exception. This is not a recent exception. There was an interruption during the period of the Great Depression and the interwar period that reversed somewhat, and you've explained some of those policies. But he had a number of policy recommendations at the end of, and I remember one of them was the estate tax, is to essentially heavily tax, as it once was done in our country, the wealthy, basically to redistribute that wealth back on the grounds that, well, in a meritocracy, you have your opportunity. And as you've pointed out in this talk, the wealthy already have an enormous advantage, even if they don't get the capital handed to them when their parents die. So what about that? Because you didn't really talk about the estate tax.
Yeah. So so the estate tax, we've been gutting the estate tax over the course of the last 40 years, and on false pretenses, right? And the pretense is, oh my gosh, the family farmer and the small business person, we don't want to hurt them. Well, the limits on the estate tax are so high now that any farmer that gets hurt by the estate tax, no longer a family farmer. And any businessman that gets hurt by the estate tax, no longer a small businessman or a woman, right? So that's just ridiculous. It's such a tiny proportion. Even before we gutted the estate tax, it was a tiny proportion of the population that was subject to the estate tax that was either a farmer or a small business individual, right? So I think the estate tax, we need to put the teeth back into it. I think that we genuinely need a wealth tax. And all the arguments against it, oh, well, it's so hard to value wealth. Well, in fact, we already do have a wealth tax, and we have property taxes, right? And it's hard to evaluate the true value of a home, but we do it, right? And you can do it with regard to any asset. There was one particular plan that was put out, and that is to have individuals self-value. Right, an individual files their taxes and they put a value on all of their assets, and then we audit that, and the penalty for undervaluing your asset is significant, right? So let individuals do all the work of evaluating the value of their assets, and put in pretty strong penalties for underestimating. I am highly in favor, and even if we taxed wealth at 5% a year, high wealth individuals would still see increases in their wealth, because I guarantee you they're getting higher than 5% return on their wealth, right? If it started at $1 billion, fine. What can you do with $2 billion that you can't do with $1 billion? Right. So I'm getting a little more into my own personal views, and this is not need speaking. But the arguments against a wealth tax, oh, well, it hasn't worked in other countries. Well, we can learn from the experience in those other countries where it didn't work, and let's put something in place that might. As an aside, we as a country, we seem uniquely disinterested in any other country's experience with any other policy.
Well, related to that, it'd be interesting historically to look at what happened in Britain, because to some extent that did happen, right? They started really taxing the estates, and the big estates disappeared from 1900 or so. I don't know that history, but it'd be interesting if it's an educational comparison.
Yeah, I don't know that history very well either. But I know little anecdotes out of that history, right? One of the ways that they were taxing wealth was you would tax people based on the number of windows in their house.
Mhm.
Right. So what did people do? They started doing two things. One, they started putting in bigger windows. And two, they boarded up, if you walk around London, you can see a lot of boarded or stoned up windows. The stones in there that in the shape of window. It's just tax avoidance.
Wow.
But at the time that they really put in taxes on the very wealthy, which was in the Labor government after the Second World War, it did make a difference, but then it was reversed, I think, by Mrs. Thatcher.
Yeah, all right. The problem with the wealth tax is that the people tasked with keeping it in place are, well, the wealthy.
How much of this could be explained by regional differences? I was thinking, the Black population is higher in the South. Is that a factor? Is that aspect been looked at?
No, that's really good. That's a really good question. And I have the data available to do it. I just haven't. So I don't know. I do know that there are still significant differences when you look across regions.
Mhm.
But I don't know how much variance there is in the difference across regions.
Right. Okay, and John, one of your graphs towards the end, I would suggest changing a little bit, and that's the one on entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
It's just that on your x-axis, you don't actually go to zero. So it makes it look like some years there were 0 Black entrepreneurs. And that's kind of really making them look real bad. I think if it just went to 0, you may see what I mean. If you go
Yeah,
back and look at it.
I'm going back to have a look at it. Where did it go? You're right. It only goes down to 200.
Yeah.
Yep. No, thank you for that. It's a good idea.
Lois, you would.
My question is, what should we do when we wake up tomorrow to do something about what's happening here? Good question.
It's not a bad idea if you're gonna go to a restaurant, go to a Black-owned restaurant, or find a Black bank. It's not a bad idea to do that stuff. It's a bad idea to rely on that stuff to solve the problem. That's probably the easiest thing to do. You can go online and find all the Black-owned businesses in your neighborhood, all the Black-owned restaurants. But otherwise, it's hard. I mean, it's such a big problem as an individual. Go to town hall meetings, and when your member of Congress comes and makes themselves vulnerable to you, stand up and say, "Well, I understand that white households have 8 times the wealth of Black households. What are we doing about that?" Just ask that simple question.
One more thing about, you said affirmative action. Also, what needs to increase rather than what it is doing now, decreasing, is state support of education and aiming for free higher education.
I agree with that completely. Right. Tuition, our public schools in California and in other states, they're becoming more like private schools, right? So the level of state funding for the UC system is a mere fraction of what it was, 30, 40 years ago. I agree with that completely. Yep. Linda, did you have a question?
Well, I had a comment. It just seems to me that in terms of future change to these policies, it's going to rely a lot on the younger generations. And if they're not getting this information, I don't see how that's going to happen. My grandson is at Texas State University in the economics program. He's getting a double major in that in computer science. But as far as his economics program, I don't think they talk about this kind of information. And I sent him the last one of these that was taped, and I'm going to send him this one. And I wish more of them were, available.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And I could probably be faulted for not trying to get need on more onto college campuses. I've tried to get into classrooms, but everybody that I talk to says, well, we have so much material that we have to present. We don't have a spare lecture. I get some of the same pushback from high school teachers. I think even more important probably to get into high school classrooms. Generate this awareness so that they can better understand the importance of going to college and taking some economics so that you understand these things better. But it's super hard to get into high school classrooms. I've been into quite a few in Marin, but that's only because of personal contacts. Right? I don't have personal contacts in the education community. And I don't fault teachers for that, because my understanding is that so many of them have been burned. Somebody will say, oh yes, we have this nonpartisan organization, we don't have an agenda other than education, and then they come in and they preach something that the teacher was really not interested in their preaching. So they only get in once, but the teacher's burned, making it harder for those of us who I will claim to have a more noble agenda. Makes it harder for us to get into classrooms. I'm going to be teaching an economics class at Marin Academy here next fall, and you can bet that a lot of this information that you guys have been getting is going to be sprinkled throughout my class.
That's good.
That's great. Now that we know about you and what you do, we can help pass the word along as well.
Oh, please do. Please do.
Yep. Yeah, it's been very interesting.
Great.
And eye-opening.
And I'd be delighted to schedule another course for you all.
Fantastic.
This one was more or less limited to issues surrounding inequality, but we have a ton of other issues that I'm sure you folks would be interested in. Right now our talk on the federal debt is pretty popular. We have a talk on cryptocurrencies, a talk on housing economics, talk on climate change economics, wide variety of different topics that we can bring in.
Well, I'm sure we'll take advantage of that in the fall.
Absolutely.
How about how AI is going to affect economics?
We don't have a talk on that, but we probably should start developing one.
You could put one together in 15 seconds.
It's going to be bad for low-skilled, low-income workers.
Right.
Yeah.
Problem is, I don't know where that cutoff is going to be, right? As AI and its capability is accelerating pretty rapidly.
If it moves up to personal assistance, that isn't low income.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Oh.
Yeah.
I had a question.
Mhm.
When you say that most of us are cut out from the best investments, I mean, isn't that things like private equity? And would you want to be getting that money?
Oh well, so that's certainly an issue, right? I would love access to the returns that private equity generates, but I wouldn't necessarily like to be affiliated with some of their activities, right? An awful lot of what's going on in healthcare right now is being driven by private equity.
And it's terrible.
Right.
It is terrible.
Absolutely.
Yep. All right. Any other comments or questions?
Well, that was terrific, John.
Really.
Very
Well,
well
thank you
done.
very much. I'm glad that you all enjoyed it. I'll look forward to coming back to UC Santa Cruz. Maybe at some point I can come down and give a couple of lectures in person.
That would be great.
All right.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Thanks
Thank
for coming, everybody. Glad you enjoyed it. I'll look forward to seeing you all again sometime.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.